So we're seeing, if you look now at what are the big drivers of infectious diseases right now, in not only in the U.S. but globally, there are really some interesting forces, and a lot of them are social determinants. So a big one is poverty. That's a huge one. The other big one is political instability and war, because it interrupts public health control measures. So, for instance, Venezuela, which was leading public health control in Latin America for decades, with the collapse of the economy in the Chavez era and now into the Maduro area, we've got a terrible situation where we've had measles return in a big way, so huge numbers of cases of measles. We've had all the neglected tropical diseases come back, as well as malaria, Chagas disease, leishmaniasis. So it's really interesting how that is destabilizing the whole region, because now Venezuela has one of the largest diasporas of people, as big as the diaspora coming out of Syria and Iraq. So now the diseases are moving into adjacent areas of Brazil and Colombia and Ecuador. And so it's really, and that's another big driver, is political instability. The third one we think is climate change may be very important. So, why did we see this big surge of chikungunya virus infection in the Western Hemisphere, or Zika? We don't really understand the forces of that. And what's going on in Southern Europe right now is quite concerning. We've had malaria return to Greece after it's been gone for 70 years. Malaria has returned to Italy. We're seeing schistosomiasis, a neglected tropical disease, on the island of Corsica. We've got dengue, chikungunya, West Nile virus across Italy, Spain, Portugal. So we're trying to understand why that is, and there's some thought that climate change may be a big driver of that.
Now, what other infectious diseases or parasites, rather, do they have vaccines for? Do they have a vaccine for toxo?
There's no vaccine for toxoplasmosis. There's a prototype malaria vaccine.
Prototype?
Yeah. Well, there's a malaria vaccine. It's called Mosquirix. That's the trade name. That was developed, supported with a lot of funding from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and working in partnership with GlaxoSmithKline. And that malaria vaccine now has been approved for use in children by the European Medicine Agency, and it's being introduced now in 3 countries in Africa: Malawi, Ghana, and I forgot the third one. I think it was Tanzania.
Is there an adverse reaction that people have to that stuff? Because I know the traditional malaria medication, I had friends that took it and had horrible nightmares.
Oh, yeah, malarium is terrible, yeah. It gives you very lurid dreams. And no. And so far, no.
And so when you say children, how old are the children that they're vaccinating with this?
Well, the problem that you get into with malaria is that before 6 months of age, you have maternal antibodies on board. You remember, you're born with antibodies from your mother, and those start to wane by 6 months of age. So the ones who get hospitalized with measles, what's called cerebral malaria, which is a devastating condition, or severe malaria anemia, which is also a killer, are those children between 6 months of age and 5 years of age. So those are the ones that we want to protect.
Now,
and it's one of the leading killers of children globally right now.
Right.
And we don't have a vaccine.
Sickle cell is connected to it, correct? Right? Sickle cell it has something to do with people developing an immunity to malaria?
Yeah, I'm surprised you knew that.
I found out from Tiffany Haddish.
Who's Tiffany Haddish?
How dare you? She's a very funny comedian.
Okay. I'm sure she is, but she's right. It's not really.
I was like, wow.
It's not really immunity, but it's a natural protection. So individuals who have the sickle cell trait seem to be partially resistant to malaria, and that's the thinking why the gene for sickle cell has been preserved in Africa for so long, is because it does confer some protection against malaria. So it's a reason for keeping the gene in the gene pool.
Yeah, we were actually discussing it because a friend that I grew up with died from it. So it seems to only exist in African Americans or Africans. Is that correct?
No, there's some other places as well, but predominantly in Africa and among African Americans. So.
Or people whose ancestors came from these tropical climates where they possibly did.
Yeah, so it's really quite an amazing story.
So there's no vaccine for toxoplasmosis. Is there anything on the horizon? Is there anything being worked on? Because that's a big one, right?
It's a real big problem among people with HIV/AIDS, for instance. Because it reactivates your toxoplasmosis, and I even see it in kids sometimes. But the thinking is
reactivates it. How so?
Well, what happens is it's in some countries up to 30% of people are actually infected with toxoplasma. And the parasite has the ability to undergo a dormancy state in the body until your immune system gets compromised, either because of AIDS or because if you get some kind of medicine that suppresses your immune system, and then it can reactivate it and cause what's called cerebral toxoplasmosis, which is quite serious. So most people handle their toxoplasmosis very well. You die with it and don't even know you have it. But in some cases it gets reactivated. Right now, there doesn't seem to be a lot of incentive for developing a toxoplasmosis vaccine, although I'd be very interested to work on something like that.
Why would there be no incentive? It's such a large-scale disease. It's hundreds of millions of people worldwide, right?
That's right. And part of the problem is we have almost no information on the actual number of people who have it and how extensive it is. So we call that disease burden. We don't have good disease burden estimates of toxoplasmosis.
I'm scared to get tested. I've had a bunch of cats. I've had feral cats.
Yeah,
and I'm crazy.
Well, there's a good chance you are infected, but as long as your immune system's intact, then you're okay. Now, there is a related disease from cats called toxocariasis, and that's a parasitic worm infection we're finding in the United States among the poor. And that's a worm. So what happens is if you go into poor neighborhoods, and you see a lot of feral cats and dogs in poor neighborhoods, almost 100% of them have this worm in their intestines. And they're seeding the environment with eggs in their feces, and the feces are spread all over the poor neighborhoods. Kids come into contact with them, and the worm has the ability to migrate through the brain and cause cerebral toxocariasis. And I think it's an important cause of developmental delays. It's one of those neglected diseases in the U.S. I talk about in the book.
And there's no vaccine for that either?
There's no vaccine for it. And we have very little awareness about it.
Wow. Yeah, I've never even heard of it until just now.
Right.
So
that's not rare. I mean, in some cases, up to 10% of certain populations, like African Americans living in poverty, are infected with it.
And it's primarily pets, or is it rodents as well?
Probably mostly stray dogs. And it's not even pets; it's mostly stray dogs and cats. And this is an example of a neglected tropical disease. Here's a disease of up to 10% of African Americans living in poverty in the United States, and almost nobody is studying it.
Wow.
Right?
And it can affect the way your mind functions.
Right. It's been linked now to developmental delays. So, everybody wants to know why, kids living in poverty have developmental delays, and people just assume it's because they live in deprived environments and that sort of thing. But I think toxocariasis is an important underlying reason for it. And this is an example of a neglected disease. Everybody's heard of Ebola, right? And everyone's worried about Ebola. And the truth is Ebola is never going to come to the United States.
Why is that?
It's never going to be, because it's too difficult to transmit. Unless you have a complete collapse in the health system, we're never going to have Ebola epidemics in the United States. But here's a disease of 10% of African Americans living in poverty, and no one's heard of it, and there's no incentive to study it. So that's why I'm trying to raise awareness about these poverty-related diseases in the United States.
That's crazy. I don't understand why people don't talk about that one.
Yeah.
That one seems insane.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. It's a no-brainer, right? I mean, and so, but it's very hard to get people to care about diseases of poverty. And this is one of the striking things about when I wrote the book was, I've had a lot of success getting people to care about neglected tropical diseases in Africa, and worked with the U.S. Agency for International Development to support a package of medicines that's now being administered to over 1 billion people annually. And that, is one of my proudest accomplishments is helping to raise awareness about neglected tropical diseases like we've been talking about, hookworm and schistosomiasis in Africa, Asia, Latin America.
Right.
But the minute I talk about poverty-related diseases in the U.S., the lights go out.
Why is that?
I don't know. I can't figure out what I'm doing wrong. I've had so much success getting people to care about NTDs, neglected tropical diseases, in poor developing countries. But, there's been no response to this book. It is And the estimates that I come up with in the book are we have 12 million Americans live in poverty with a neglected tropical disease. Toxoplasmosis is one of them. Another one is Chagas disease, and the list goes on. And it's been very hard to get people to care about the poor in this country.
That's very strange to me. And I've always said that about the way we treat other countries. We want to send them aid and rebuild these countries, but we don't do anything about these terrible communities that have been terrible in this country for decade upon decade.
Right, and so I try to make the point the world has changed. You know, this old norm of global health, developed versus developing, it still exists, but it's going away. What we're seeing is a general rise in all economies. I mean, some African countries have 8 or 9% economic growth, but it's all leaving behind a bottom segment of society. And so I don't care where you show me poverty, whether it's in Texas or Alabama or Nigeria or Bangladesh, I will show you these poverty-related diseases. And, you know, I know, what's her name, AOC, the congresswoman from New York, has talked a little bit about hookworm in Alabama. So last time I was in Washington, I dropped off a copy of the book in her office, but no response yet.
Well, she's probably pretty busy too.
Yeah, she's doing a lot of other stuff.
If you had a magic wand and someone said you could do whatever you want to fix this, what would you do?
So I did meet with a couple of people on the Hill, and they asked me that question, what's the magic wand? And there's a couple of things. One, we need to actually look for these diseases, because the problem is the diseases they cause are very subtle, like developmental delays. So that if you're a kid who lives in poverty with developmental delays, the pediatrician doesn't even think to do a test for toxoplasmosis. So we need to raise awareness. We need to go into poor communities across the country and actually take a blood test and actually measure for the presence of that disease or that parasite.
Once you find that disease, what would you do then?
Well, it depends on the disease. In some cases, we have treatments for it. Like the treatment for toxoplasmosis is a 5-day course of a simple pill of albendazole.
And it cures it?
And it cures it. So
really?
Yeah. So we have interventions. So one, doing what I call active surveillance, looking for these diseases. The other one is really trying to understand how these diseases are transmitted. What is it about poor neighborhoods that is facilitating transmission? I think the third problem is the diagnostic tests themselves, because they're very complicated tests. Sometimes, they're done at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Our lab at our National School of Tropical Medicine does a few of them, but it's not like when you go for blood work and your doctor and you get a little lab slip from Quest Diagnostics with the the blood chemistries, the blood counts. There's no box there for toxoplasmosis and Chagas disease. So we need more improved tests, point of care diagnostic tests.
Not just
also.
Improved tests, but just letting people
make it
know
more accessible.
something.
Yeah, and so they don't have to send it off to the CDC or to our National School of Tropical Medicine.
Is there a treatment for toxo?
There is a treatment for toxoplasmosis.
What is it?
It's a paramethamine sulfa drug, but it requires a long treatment course.
How long?
I'd have to look up the number of days. I haven't treated a patient with toxoplasmosis in a while, but.
And it kills it effectively?
It can, yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, I thought it was something you kept for life.
Well, if you don't get treated.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So
and then if you're immune compromised and it comes back, then that's a problem as well.
So most people that have it really don't even know they have it.
That's right.
Yeah.
And most people who have neglected tropical diseases don't know they have it either. So that in Texas, for instance, we have transmission of a parasitic disease called Chagas disease. It's a cause of heart disease. We, our members of our faculty were actually able to track down individuals who had donated blood, and the Gulf Coast Regional Blood Authority actually found people positive for Chagas disease. They were told to go see their primary health care provider. And though unfortunately the primary health care provider is not educated about these diseases, and they just assume must be a false positive. So, our faculty had tracked them down and were able to get them into treatment.
And what is the treatment for Chagas disease?
It's an anti-parasitic agent called benznidazole.
And that kills it?
That can kill if you catch it early enough, but sometimes you don't catch it early enough.
So if it becomes systemic, then you have...
Then that's why we're trying to develop a therapeutic vaccine for this disease.
Oh.
But again, it's a therapeutic vaccine for a poverty-related disease, so it's very tough.
God, Man.
So the point is these diseases are widespread among the poor, and we just don't pay attention to them.
Yeah. That's great.
And so I think, again, I'd love to hear your thoughts. I mean, what is it that we just turn our backs on the poor in this country?
It's disturbing.
It's very disturbing.
There's a dismissive attitude.
And they disproportionately affect people of color as well, right?
Yeah.
Because, because it's so linked to poverty.
Well, also, right, slavery. Yeah, I mean, the history of slavery in this country, then the history of systemic racism in places where they just literally would not sell homes to people who are African American. All these things are connected to the contribution of maintaining these impoverished communities, and there's been almost no effort whatsoever, other than the people living in the community trying to do better and raise everybody up.
Right.
There's been no effort whatsoever by the federal government to step in and try to rehabilitate, like a large-scale approach to rehabilitating places like the ghettos of Houston or Baltimore or Detroit.
I thought I knew what poverty. Before I moved to Texas in 2011, I was chair of microbiology at George Washington University, and I thought I knew what poverty looked like. I moved down to the Gulf Coast, and it's a different animal. I mean, the depth and breadth of poverty in the Gulf Coast and the southern part of the United States is just extraordinary. And it's been very hard to get people to want to really take it on and really address these poverty-related diseases.
What do you think the cause of it is? I mean, you've studied this for quite a while.
What, the cause of the neglect?
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know. Is it something about American exceptionalism or something that we just don't want to admit? We have poor people. I don't know. I wasn't the first to come up, to raise this issue about poverty. When I was in high school or junior high school, I was forced to read a book, and at the time I didn't care about it. It was called The Other America. It was written by a fantastic social activist named Michael Harrington. Who was, I think someone told me he's a very devout Catholic, actually. And he wrote this book called The Other America. It talks about the hidden poverty off the road. And the actual number of people who live in extreme poverty hasn't changed since that book was written in the early 60s. That book was what helped Lyndon, first Kennedy, then Lyndon Johnson, launch the war on poverty in 1964. I dusted off that book, and it still works today. And that's how I start out talking about my book, Blue Marble Health, about that book, The Other America by Michael Harrington. Yeah,
that is a very strange thing, our acceptance of these communities. And I've always said that if you want to make America a better place, the best thing to do is not invade other countries or intervene. The best thing to do is try to rebuild these impoverished communities.
Yeah, well, Gandhi
give people a way out.
Gandhi once said a civilization is judged by the treatment of its minorities, and we're not, by that criteria, we're not doing so well. Our country was visited by the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Poverty in 2017, and his numbers came up with, we have 19.4 million Americans who live in what's called extreme poverty, that is at half the U.S. poverty line, and roughly around 5 million Americans living on less than $2 a day, the same benchmark you'd use for global poverty everywhere.
5 million.
Yeah. And guess what? Those probably all have neglected tropical diseases.
5 million people.
Just like those living in extreme poverty in Africa and everywhere
5 million people living on $14 a week.
$2 a day, yeah.
That's insane.
Yeah. The University of Michigan Center on Poverty has also shown that we have I forget the number, 2.7 million families living on less than $2 a day, which is probably about the same as the 5 million number.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
And again, this is not a topic that is very popular. I mean, when you see presidential debates, this is not something that comes up.
No, nobody talks about it. And again, even for disease. I mean, what are the diseases we hear about? Ebola and diseases like that. And sometimes in my frustration, I say, these are imaginary diseases, and yet here we've got widespread diseases of the poor in the U.S., and the lights go out.
You remember when that woman came back from Africa, and she was a nurse, and she had been in some connection contacted with Ebola. She didn't have it, and they wanted to quarantine her.
Oh, yeah, and they stuck her out in some cabin on the airport or something like
crazy
that. It was
like
terrible.
that.
Yeah.
What did you think about that?
I just thought it was so cruel, and
Is it just an ignorance of how it's transmitted?
That's right.
How is
That's
it transmitted?
Right. Well, actually, Ebola, it turns out is the opposite of measles. Measles is one of the most contagious diseases known. It has a reproductive number of 12 to 18. What that means, if a single individual gets measles, 12 to 18 others get it, because the virus hangs around in the environment and it's so easily transmissible.
Hangs around like if you touch this table.
That's right. That's right. Or even in the atmosphere.
Oh.
So and that's why you get these really large measles outbreaks like you're seeing in Washington State. And usually those are infants under the age of 12 months, not yet old enough to get vaccinated. They're the ones who wind up hospitalized and sick. The Ebola is just the opposite. Ebola is a reproductive number of 2 or 3. So unless you're taking care of a dead or dying Ebola patient or someone who's recently died, because it's only towards the end stage of the disease that you really get large numbers of virus particles in the body, you're not going to get Ebola. So the reason it's being so hard right now to contain in Democratic Republic of Congo is not because it's so highly contagious. It's just that the place is decimated by the collapse in infrastructure associated with civil war. So even though we have now an Ebola vaccine, it's hard to vaccinate everybody.
And how is it transmitted?
Ebola by contact with fluids of somebody with Ebola.
So it has to get into your tissue somehow or another?
Right.
Yeah. Oh. What else should we worry about? You're freaking me out.
Well, the point is a lot of these diseases are solvable if we just put our mind to it. So one
or
of the things
people are even aware of it. I mean,
well,
it
one of the
like
things I say in the book is because these diseases are so widespread among the poor in the G20 countries, if we could get the elected or the leaders of those G20 countries together at a G20 summit and say we're really going to do something about the neglected diseases in our own borders, and I'll include the United States, we could get rid of 2/3 of the world's poverty-related neglected diseases right off the bat.
Wow.
So a lot of it is political will, or ignorance, or lack of awareness and political will.
Well, it seems like in this country, ignorance is a big part of it because this is something I've thought about many times, but I didn't know about chaga. I didn't know about a lot of these other diseases you're describing.
Yeah, no, I mean, so we need to raise awareness about these. That's why I was so thrilled to come here, because I've just amplified the number of people who've heard of this concept of blue marble health, which is a name that I've given a different name from global health to separate it from the two. So, coming on here is so powerful in terms of amplifying that message.